There are moments in history when power doesn't arrive with noise, but with silence. Not a gunshot, not a speech, not a crowd, just a room that changes temperature. Just faces that learn almost overnight a new way of holding themselves. Just a silence that was not there before, and then suddenly was, and stayed, and became the air everyone breathed. This is not the story of a dictator, not the story of the wars or the palaces or the statue that fell in a Baghdad square on a day the whole world watched. This is the story of a girl who watched him become one. She never told it. No one asked. But she was there, and she saw it all. She was just a servant in a government residence in Baghdad, not a grand palace, not yet. A large building in the Kark district on the west bank of the Tigris River, the kind of place that held the serious, unhurried business of men who believed they were building something permanent. She had come to work there as a young woman in the late 1960s. She swept floors. She carried tea. She changed linen. She was invisible in the way that only people with no power can be invisible. Completely, reliably, useful to everyone and noticed by no one. Baghdad in those years was a city in motion. The monarchy had been overthrown in 1958. King Faisal II killed in a coup that shocked the Arab world with its speed and its violence. Since then, Iraq had gone through governments the way some cities go through weather, quickly and often without warning. The Ba'ath Party had seized power briefly in 1963, then lost it, then regained it in 1968 in a bloodless coup that installed Ahmad Hassan al-Bakr as president. Al-Bakr was in his 50s, a general, a man who had the bearing of authority without the appetite for the daily work of maintaining it. His deputy was younger, much younger. She cleaned the floors. She carried the tea. She was invisible. And that is why she saw everything.
Lần đầu cô thấy Saddam Hussein, hình ảnh ban đầu, bình tĩnh, ít nói.
He wasn't loud, not like the others. She had been around powerful men long enough to know their particular vocabulary, the way they filled rooms with their voices, the way they laughed too hard and spoke too fast, the way they needed the room to feel their presence before they had established any actual authority. He didn't do that. When he entered a room, nothing obvious changed. No one stood, no announcement, no shift in the ambient noise, and yet something shifted. She noticed it the first time she saw him. A man in his early 30s, broad-shouldered, with the kind of stillness that is not the stillness of a person at rest, but the stillness of a person who has decided not to move. His eyes moved. They took inventory, but his body was very quiet. He spoke quietly, almost too quietly. You had to lean in to hear him, and that, she would understand later, was not an accident. When he spoke, no one interrupted. When he finished, there was a moment before anyone else spoke. A small, instinctive silence, the kind that bodies produce before the mind has decided to produce it. She had seen this man from a distance, tray in hand, carrying tea to the outer room while the meeting continued inside. She could not hear the words. She didn't need to. She could see the faces of the men listening to him. The faces told her everything she needed to know. He was 32 years old. His name was Saddam Hussein. He had been born in a mud brick house in the village of Al-Aujah near Tikrit in 1937. His father had died before he was born. His stepfather had treated him with the particular cruelty of men who resent children that are not theirs. He had left for Baghdad at 10 years old, walking, to live with his uncle. He had taught himself to read. He had joined the Bath Party at 20. At 22, he had participated in an assassination attempt on the Prime Minister, a plan that failed, that left him shot in the leg, that forced him to flee the country by swimming across the Tigris River at night with a knife between his teeth, pulling the bullet from his own thigh on the other bank. He had come back. Men like that always come back. The meetings began to happen at night. Not all of them. There had always been evening meetings, the kind that overran their scheduled hours because the men inside couldn't agree, or agreed too much, or simply needed to feel the weight of the decisions they were making. Those meetings had their own energy, their own particular noise. These were different. Doors closed tighter. Not slammed, that would have drawn attention. Just pulled shut with a care that was itself a kind of statement. Voices lowered. She would stand in the corridor with the tray, waiting to be called in, and she would hear the shape of conversation without the content, the rhythm of questions and answers, the particular cadence of men being careful with their words. She didn't understand the Bath Party, not in the way the men inside understood it. The ideology, the pan-Arab nationalism, the internal factions and the personal loyalties, and the specific calculations of who owed what to whom. The Ba'ath had come to power in 1968, promising a new Iraq, unified, strong, free from the foreign interference that had shaped the country since the British drew its borders 40 years earlier. It had the energy of a movement that believed in itself. It had also, beneath that energy, the paranoia of men who had seized something valuable and understood that other men would try to take it from them. But she understood the building. She understood that the Ba'ath Party, which had seized power from the previous government in 1968, was not a unified thing. It was a coalition of men with different interests and different amounts of patience, held together by a shared enemy and a shared hunger for what they had just acquired. She understood that within that coalition, Saddam Hussein occupied a specific position. He was not the president. Al-Bakr was the president. Saddam was the deputy, a title that in most places means a great deal of responsibility and not very much power. But she had seen enough to understand that titles and power were not always the same thing. Names were spoken in those night meetings, then never spoken again. She didn't connect these things immediately. You don't when they happen slowly, when each individual event can be explained away as coincidence or reassignment or simple absence. But she was a woman who had learned to notice patterns, and the pattern she was noticing had a shape she didn't like. She didn't understand politics, but she understood when people were afraid. One day, a man who always greeted her didn't come back. He had been one of the senior administrators in the building, a man in his 40s with a careful gray beard and the habit of saying good morning to anyone he passed in the corridor, regardless of their position. She had appreciated this. It was a small thing, but small things matter when you are invisible. One Tuesday he said good morning. The following Monday he was not there. His desk had been cleared. His name was not mentioned in the morning briefings she heard through closed doors. The other administrators moved past the space where his office had been without slowing down, without looking toward the door, as if he had never been there at all. She waited. She thought perhaps he was ill, or traveling, or had been transferred to another ministry. These things happened. She told herself these things happened. He did not come back. No one asked about him. That was the part she could not make sense of. Not the absence, but the silence around it. When an ordinary person disappears, other people ask questions. They wonder. They check. The absence creates a kind of noise. Here, the absence created nothing. She tried once to look at another administrator, a woman she had exchanged a few words with over the years, as if to ask. The woman looked back at her for a moment, then looked away. Quickly and finally, in the way of someone who has decided something. That was enough. She understood. The man with the gray beard had not been transferred, and the silence around his absence was not natural. It was agreed upon. An unspoken decision made by everyone simultaneously, without discussion. This was how it worked. She was beginning to understand that now. You did not ask. Not because you didn't wonder, but because wondering, expressed out loud, was itself a risk. A question could be heard. A question could be reported. A question could be interpreted as sympathy. And sympathy for the wrong person was its own kind of accusation. So people kept their faces arranged. They kept their questions internal. They got very good at looking at a blank wall where a person used to be and letting their eyes move on. She had grown up in a country where governments changed and people adjusted and ordinary life continued beneath the turbulence of politics, the way a river continues beneath the ice that forms on its surface. She had believed, without examining the belief, that there was a floor, some level below which things could not go, some basic minimum of ordinary decency that even the most ruthless systems preserved for the people who were not their enemies. She was beginning to understand that this belief had been an article of faith, not an observation. And faith, unlike observation, does not survive contact with sufficient evidence to the contrary. And in that silence, something grew. Not grief, not anger, something colder. An understanding of the new rules which had never been written down and never needed to be. It wasn't sudden. It never is. Change like that doesn't arrive all at once. It accumulates. Small deposits, laid down over months, until one day the landscape is different and you cannot identify the moment it changed because it changed in increments too small to mark. But one day she noticed it. His eyes. They no longer searched the room. Before, and she could not have said exactly when before ended. His gaze had moved when he entered a space, taking inventory, measuring. The eyes of a man who is still calculating, still assessing the distance between where he is and where he intends to be. Now they were still, not because he had stopped paying attention, because he no longer needed to calculate. The room had already been assessed and found to be his, and there was nothing left to measure. She noticed it in other things, too. He walked slower. Not the slowness of hesitation, the slowness of a man who understands that time is now moving according to his schedule, and there is no reason to hurry towards something that is already waiting. People stepped aside without being told. Conversations ended before he reached them. Men who had once spoken freely in the corridors now spoke differently, more briefly, more carefully, with a new habit of looking slightly past whoever they were talking to, in case someone else was listening. The building had reorganized itself around him, not because he had ordered it to, because it had decided to. She had seen this process described in the few books she had ever read, the way a heavy object warps the space around it simply by existing. She had not understood it then as a physical description. She understood it now as a human one. He hadn't changed the rules. He had become the thing the rules were about. They owned it. There was a day when the building felt different. She would not be able to say afterward that she had known what was happening. She did not have access to that information. She did not sit in the meetings. She did not read the documents. She did not know that on that day, July 22nd, 1979, Saddam Hussein had formally assumed the presidency, that al-Bakr had resigned under circumstances that were called voluntary and were understood by everyone to be something else. She knew none of this. She knew only what the building felt like. No one spoke above a whisper, not even the men who had always filled the halls with their voices. Now they leaned closer when they spoke, as if sound itself had become dangerous, as if a word at normal volume could travel through walls and arrive somewhere it wasn't meant to go. Footsteps were softer. Doors closed without sound. The guards stood differently, straighter, stiller, with the particular expression of men who have been given new instructions and are being very careful to follow them correctly. She carried the tray, as she always did, but her hands felt heavier, not from the weight, from the understanding that what she was carrying, 2 cups of tea, an ordinary object, an ordinary task, now existed inside a different world than it had that morning. She passed faces she recognized. Men who had once looked certain now looked careful. There is a difference. Certainty stands upright. Carefulness bends slightly at the shoulders, keeps the eyes moving, measures the distance to the nearest door. Everyone in that building was bending. She did not hear an announcement. There was no speech, no ceremony she was invited to witness. Just a feeling, the kind that arrives before the mind has processed the evidence, the kind that the body understands before the language catches up. Something had been sealed, a decision made somewhere behind a closed door, a line crossed that would not be uncrossed. She didn't know what had happened, but she knew it had already happened. And she understood, with the clarity that comes from years of watching, that what she felt in that building on that afternoon was not the beginning of something. It was the end of the possibility that things might go differently. She stayed. What else could she do? Leaving is a choice that requires somewhere to go, something to go to, the resources to make the distance between here and there. She had none of those things. She had a room, a wage, a routine. She had the invisible woman's particular form of safety, which is not safety at all, but simply the low probability of being noticed. So she remained. She cleaned the same floors, slow circles, back and forth. Carried the same tea, 2 cups, sometimes more. Hands steady, always steady. But now she never looked up. Before, she had lowered her eyes out of habit, the learned reflex of a woman who has been trained through years of small corrections that her role does not include looking directly at power. Now it was something else. Not habit, instinct. The deep animal understanding that in a room where a predator has taken up residence, visibility is its own kind of danger. The years that followed would bring things she had not imagined on the day she first carried tea down that hallway. The wars, the gas, the mass graves in the desert. In 1988, in the Kurdish town of Halabja, chemical weapons were used against civilians. 5,000 people died in a single day, men and women and children who had done nothing except be present in a place that had been designated as a problem to be solved. The photographs that eventually reached the outside world showed people frozen in the positions they had fallen. A father curled around his child. A woman reaching toward a door that was already too late. She did not see those photographs, not then, but she lived inside the same system that produced them. She carried tea for the men who gave the orders, or knew the men who gave the orders, or were careful enough never to ask about the orders.
She was not complicit. She had no power to refuse, no power to change, no lever to pull. But she was present. And presence, even silent presence, is its own kind of witnessing. She never looked up. History will remember his name, Saddam Hussein. The name printed in textbooks, attached to dates, connected to photographs of a man standing at a podium or sitting in a courtroom or staring at a camera in a hole in the ground where soldiers found him. In December 2003, disheveled and old, a long way from the man who had stood still in a room and let everyone else adjust. History will remember the wars, the weapons, the number of dead as precisely as such numbers can be known. It will not remember her. No record carries her name. No archive holds her account. The building she cleaned is gone, destroyed, rebuilt, renamed in the chaos that followed the regime's collapse. The corridor where she stood with a tray in her hands, watching a man learn to own a room, no longer exists in the form it took in her memory. She saw it all, not the speeches, not the victories. She saw a young man enter rooms and wait. She saw people learn to be afraid without being told to. She saw a man with gray beard say, "Good morning," and then stop saying it, and then not be there anymore. She saw a building reorganize itself around one person, slowly, the way water finds the lowest point. She saw the silence where power truly begins, not in the announcement, not in the ceremony, in the moment when the room stops asking questions, in the moment when people choose, quietly, individually, each one alone, that the cost of knowing is higher than the cost of not asking. She made that choice too. She had no other option. And that is perhaps the most honest thing that can be said about how power settles into a place. It doesn't force everyone to approve. It simply makes disapproval too expensive to afford. And then it waits in the silence, where it always begins.